On NDTV's latest show, India Through the Eyes of Its Icons, joining us today is a man who actually needs no introduction, variously described by most neutral observers as country's most well-known legal eagle, a top legal mind internationally, and somebody who has formerly been the Solicitor General of this country, Mr. Harish Salve. Mr. Salve, you have practiced through decades of legal system in this country, and during those years, this country's legal system has also variously evolved. I mean, obviously, since independence, there have been various interpretations of the Constitution on various key tricky matters, including the constitutional amendments. What are your own views about the milestones in this journey? What are your views about how the constitutional interpretation or the legal court's interpretation over the years in our journey through the independent years, which has been actually a very momentous journey?
Well, our constitution has had a fascinating journey since independence. It has blossomed into a very powerful instrument where we have checks and balances in place. The Supreme Court, right from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, laid a path of caution, a path of they displayed great wisdom in which they steered the destiny of India through constitutional interpretations, giving the government enough space to run the country, drawing lines where they became necessary. Yes, we have had an aberration. The whole emergency was an aberration, and the judges catapulted, and none of us flinch from saying that. But what followed thereafter was the Supreme Court, which recreated its identity. And I can never tire of saying this. We had the Krishnayarization of Indian jurisprudence. Justice Krishna Iyer and then people like Justice Bhagwati, they led a complete movement, as it were, to give expansive meaning to constitutional rights, and other constitutions have followed us. So that has been a wonderful, wonderful journey of our constitution. But when we talk about strengths, we must also talk of some things where we have gone wrong, and two areas where we are going wrong. And this is a constitutional jurisprudence is, as I say, always work in progress. Two areas where we have gone wrong and we need to look hard and we need to look sharp is this overexpansion of judicial interference in day-to-day life. The judiciary is not created to deal with administrative problems. And what happens is not just governmental interference. In fact, many times governments are happy if the judges take over and pass orders so that the government is off the hook. But what happens is the judges take up cases which are not manageable by judicial standards. They create hopes, and then those hopes fall away. And of the latest, I will give an example. Most probably the Supreme Court, I mean, I'm not saying I've not applied my mind to it. The neat judgment of the Supreme Court is absolutely right. But the way in which the court intervened and took the case on board and dealt with it, and then the conclusion, you build up hopes of a narrative which is going on in public, which is partly politically driven, and then those hopes fall away. In India today, we have, and it's a strength of Indian democracy, we have a very noisy democracy. If the court starts picking up issues from the noise of Indian democracy, you set up, you create hopes, you create aspirations in people, and then the judgment doesn't meet up and everything goes wrong. So the Supreme Court needs to do some course correction and decide which are the causes which it will deal with. And excessive interference, I must confess, what I consider, and this is my personal opinion, excessive interference in day-to-day working of government. That this is one area where we need some course correction. And the other area where we need course correction is the manner in which judges are appointed. But I'm sure all this will happen. We have a very robust constitution. And finally, I say, Anybody who talks of the Constitution being in danger is talking nonsense. And I say so for one reason. Democracy is ultimately in the hearts of every citizen. If democracy dies in the hearts of citizens, no court and no constitution can save it. 1976, there was an attempt to kill democracy. The people of India brought democracy back. Till the people of India have such strong values, and the people who rule India know perfectly well the only model which will work in India is a model of democracy. So I don't think any constitution is ever in danger.
Mr. Salve, since you have elaborated on the courts responding to what you say, a noisy democracy, that certainly is a beautiful phrase. But don't you think that in the NEET case or in similar cases, when the courts respond, they're only responding to the voices of people? There are concerns. Of course, there may be some vested interests as well. There may be politics at play. But the larger question is that the courts are being responsive.
Maria, this is precisely my concern. The courts are co-equal institutions. There are certain voices of the people to which governments must respond. The courts get into things like should a drought be declared or not be declared. That's not their job. If there is a drought, the government of the day has to hear voices of the people and respond. The court must limit itself to dealing with, there's a very nice expression which is used in constitutional law. The court must limit itself to cases which can be resolved by judicially manageable standards. Voices of the people is a very dangerous trend if that is the sole consideration for a court to act. Yes, if a petition involving a constitutional issue is brought before the court in the correct way, and I'm not talking of procedural correctness and the trappings and formalities, is brought in its correct time and correct way before the court must deal with it. You may give it priority. But voices of the people, when courts start saying we are responding to the voices of the people, it worries me. The court is not a populist institution. The court is a check and constitutional check and balance on governments which are meant to act on populist demands.
Mr. Salve, this probably is the most tricky question to answer, but I am sure a man of your caliber would find it a fair game. And if I don't ask you this question, then there are very few probably who would be in a position to answer this question. How do you think India as a nation has fared in terms of upholding the principles of justice, equality and liberty enshrined in the Constitution in these years that have followed since independence?
No, we have done, there is no court which is free from blame. Let's take one of the most powerful constitutional courts in the world, the US Supreme Court. You have to read the kind of criticism of some of its recent judgments, including the Trump immunity judgment. So every court has had moments where it has come to decisions which have been sharply and strongly criticized. So this is a part of the way constitutional law works. But my concern, Maria, really is that our courts must, like all courts, introspect and see whether they are going in the right direction. And there are time to time for course correction, because sometimes, let me tell you, what we have done is we've put the rule of law in peril. And I'll give you two examples where this has misfired very badly. One was the Hawala case. How many political reputations were damned? And what came out of it? Nothing. Let's look at the so-called 2G scam case. There was so much smoke, and where was the fire? There was no fire. When it ultimately went to trial. Now, why did the CBI file those charge sheets? Because Supreme Court is monitoring the investigation. And in Supreme Court, if you do not say somebody has committed a crime and tell the court, look, this is all hype, the court says, oh, you officer, you're not doing your job. So the officer plays it safe by coming up, framing people, doing all sorts of things. Do you know, in the Airtel case, the judge criticized the CBI officers And in fact, the trial judge directed action against them for even having filed that case. So this is what happens when courts step out of line. You put rule of law in peril. Courts have, and courts do this while interpreting law. You can't be right every time. You make mistakes. The strength of a system is you should be able to introspect and correct course. And we have done it before, and I'm sure we'll do it again.
Mr. Salve, I'm quite sure that this would be true for any time. At any point in time when there is a pillar of the democratic system, which is the judiciary, that system itself, the legal system, will face challenges. You've spoken about the challenges that the system faces today, but I'm quite sure at various points in time, these challenges would be faced by various people manning that system. But what are today's specific challenges in terms of maintaining the impartiality and the independence of the judicial system, particularly when our polity is so polarized and particularly when the system continues to be dragged in almost all the conversations that the political domain has?
See, I'll tell you, the problem is this conversation about judiciary's independence. And I'm only repeating an argument which I made in the Loya case in the Supreme Court, which ultimately the Supreme Court threw out. And that's a classic example. The moment you step into a political controversy arena, the political narrative, because that's politics, political narrative is the us and them narrative. This is a political system says, this is our allegation. And if you do not agree with your allegation, you're on the other side. Political allegations do not admit of independent adjudication. So if the courts throw out the Rafael case, if the courts throw out the Judge Loya case, etc., they say the independence of the judiciary is compromised, because they are not going to say that they started a campaign which was on a false note. So this is the danger of the courts getting involved. Having said that, I hear this nonsense all the time about the independence of the judiciary being compromised. Independence of judges is a virtue which comes from within. And I remember the great eminent jurist, God bless his soul, Mr. Silvai, arguing this in the judge's case. One of the most powerful courts is the Conseil d'État, the French administrative court. Their judges don't even have security of tenure. They get a salary. They don't get these homes and lal battis and all that in this part of the world. Now, it has been one of the most powerful courts. And their judges, there's no question of anybody tinkering with their independence, although they are ordinary paid servants of the government and they can be sacked. So this is where independence is a virtue which comes from within. Our constitution has checks and safeguards. Which government has ever had the courage to try and pull down the court, except once when or twice when Mrs. Gandhi superseded judges? Who else has had the courage to do it? So, but if despite that, judges decide politically sensitive cases, then, as you say, respond to the voice of the people. And then their response is not what you think it should be. Because sometimes a popular demand on careful analysis may actually turn out to be unjustified, as appears in the NEET case. So and then people start questioning the independence of the judiciary. So the judiciary has to be very careful on the causes it takes on board. So that if the cause is one which can be addressed through judicially manageable standards, you preserve your independence, you preserve everything. Otherwise, you give rise to this kind of narrative saying that the judiciary is compromised or its independence is this, which in India is an absolute nonsense. Who can think about the Supreme Court?
Okay, let me take you back in time. You have talked about a certain era you have witnessed in the courtrooms. Is there something that brings a smile on your face when you look back at your own career spanning over 5 decades, the challenges that you faced, any conversation that you remember that makes you feel that perhaps, things when you started was better? And how do you look at your own journey through the journey of the courtrooms?
Well, Maria, I've had the privilege of being in the courts in the 70s, immediately post-emergency. 78, we joined the bar. So that was just on the heels of emergency. We saw a resurgent Supreme Court. I've seen some very powerful judges, Krishna Iyer, Bhagwati, Justice Chinnappa Reddy, and the one who I always doff my cap to, Justice Sabyasachi Mukherjee, and how they heard constitutional cases, how they developed constitutional law. Then we had judges who built up the whole edifice of environment law, how they married it into the constitutional principles. And what always brings a smile to my face, yes, I've had the privilege of doing some huge big cases in the Supreme Court as a private lawyer, as the Solicitor General of India. But where I felt I've had an opportunity of contributing my 2 pennies worth to the environmental cause is by working very hard for years and years on the forest case. And if the decline in forests was reversed and our forests started growing, even if by minimal amounts, that is one experience which brings a smile to my face. How that jurisprudence developed, how the judges warmly responded to a developing jurisprudence. So that is one. And the second case, which always brings a smile to my face, is the Vodafone case. And you know, the Supreme Court of India's reputation as a commercial tax court in the Vodafone case was it's so enormous. The impact of the judgment is so enormous that to have a court in a developing country which deals with the law, writes such a fine judgment and sets aside $1 billion tax demand without blinking an eye. These are some cases which give the Supreme Court huge reputation. Also, the Supreme Court's treatment of human rights cases and other cases, the development of the whole jurisprudence of gender justice. So these are all great areas where our court has worked. And I wish the good work continues. And I end by this little saying, the only thing which makes my smile disappear is when I see the Supreme Court judgment in the prevention of money laundering case.
Sir, let's end this conversation with another question here. And this is about the new generation. Do you see some hope here in the generations which have followed you? Do you see them capable enough? Or if I may ask a more direct question, is the legal system, the Indian legal system, in safe hands?
Oh, I think it's in much safer hands than it was with us. Let me tell you, these youngsters who I have worked with nowadays, they are so clever, they are so committed, and they are so hardworking. It's a pleasure working with them. I always end up learning something after working with these youngsters. And I have a feeling, I see the kind of exposure they are now getting in court. They are a lot more robust, they are a lot more bold. In our days, when the first few times we got up to argue the case, we suddenly realized your voice had disappeared. The youngsters today are a lot more robust and a lot more confident. And I think the Indian legal system has a great, great future.